Hello and welcome to Springboard, your virtual university. My name is Albert Ocran, welcoming you to Ghana's foremost developmental program and that place where the greatest minds in the world converge. Springboard is brought to you by the Springboard Roadshow Foundation and proudly sponsored by MTN Ghana and the Enterprise Group with media support from the Multimedia Group and the Graphic Communications Group. So today we continue our conversation on exploring untapped resources. There is always more available than we can conceptualize as individuals, as organizations, as nations, and even as continents. And so today, our focus is what can Africa do differently? Are there untapped resources, or what you may want to call low-hanging fruits, that the continent can consider in our quest for development, sustained development? And this theme is one that I know is very dear to somebody we bring here every year in the first quarter to just discuss what's happening across the world and share some forecasts and ideas. And I must say that over the past few years, it's become a constant right here on the virtual university because he's a Springboard alumnus and therefore an integral part of everything that happens here. So today in the studios, we have the head of mining and metals at BloombergNEF based in London, Dr. Kwasi Ampofo. Kwasi, good to see you.
Good to see you, Albert, and always great to be back.
Yeah, this seat is yours every first quarter. It's become a constant part of our programming, and we miss you in the first quarter, but at least we get to have you at some point in the year to reflect. And let's hit it straight away with the past year. If you had to describe the past year since you were last year in one word, what word would it be?
I think I would say wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
What are some of the wow factors or the notable developments that would make you?
I think there are three things that I'll probably touch on. And if you look at for the first one, obviously, is elections. And in 2024 alone, countries with GDP, 2/3 of global GDP will be going into elections. South Africa, India, as we speak, Indonesia, has had theirs. Just think of pretty much almost the UK, where I'm based. I think I've talked about the US and, of course, my dear country, Ghana. So if you looked at over the last 18 months and also into the next 6 months, elections has played a key role and it will continue to play a key role. And why is this important? Albert, you know this term about election has consequences. Price of food, pretty much everything centers around that. So I think that will be the first thing I would sort of signpost in terms of the things that make me say, wow. The second thing is obviously conflict. It started with Russia, Ukraine, and now we're seeing Iran and Israel and all that. And for me, I always want to put it in the context of it probably doesn't matter to sort of an average Ghanaian somewhere in the eastern region or in the western region. But then understanding that these are places where one of the commodities we use the most, oil and gas, are extracted from. And every conflict in that region leads to higher oil and gas prices. So for example, take that woman or man in the eastern region who probably feels they are detached to what is going on in the Middle East, would go buy kerosene for light or to go buy kerosene for his or her bobo, so to speak. And you realize that kerosene prices have gone 2 or 3 times what it used to be last year. So when I look at these conflicts and the fact that it might potentially escalate or probably not, I say, wow, that really is going to have an impact on their everyday life. And the third thing that makes me say, wow, it's really technology, right? Over the last 12 months, we've seen technologies like artificial intelligence really shoot up. And it might not necessarily matter to the average Ghanaian today. But if you look at the historical trends of, for example, how everyday manufacturing jobs shifted from Ghana, shifted from the US, shifted from Europe into China. I think if you look at technologies like artificial intelligence and the ability it has to really impact professional services anywhere in the world. Today, you take your average ChatGPT and some of the things we are told that lawyers were doing, accountants were doing, could potentially be replaced by these sort of technologies in the coming months. So I think if you look at the fact that election has consequences, and 2/3 of global GDP are going to go into elections this year. If you look at the fact that conflicts are probably going to escalate oil prices or gas prices, and that affects the average person in the Eastern region because of kerosene and other oil products. And if you look at the fact that technology could disrupt professional services as we know today, I think there's very little I can say apart from wow.
The part that bothers me is the fact that you see the average Ghanaian may not consider that these things have implications. Why are we not aware of the interconnectedness of the world and the fact that something that happens in somebody's bedroom or somebody's backyard several thousands of kilometers away could impact your day-to-day life? Why are we not at the place where there's a consciousness of the interconnectedness of the world?
I have a simple answer. I think we probably should double the reach of Springboard and make sure Ghanaians are hearing some of these analysis, because I picked some of these from channels or from engaging and informative sections like these, where you connect real world issues to the average person on the street. So I think that is one learning. But then also, I also feel that the national conversation, the local conversation, the regional conversation should be able to sort of connect these two things, right? Because on one hand, you find most of our experts talking about, Russia-Ukraine war, but then very little of these are actually breaking it down into what it means, right? I have a hobby of reading pretty much almost every annual statement from Ghanaian banks every year. And there was a very common theme last year that everyone talked about Russia and Ukraine war. But what does it really mean, right? Albert, you realize that as a result of the war, like I said, oil and gas have a huge impact on inflation. If inflation goes high, what most countries do is that the monetary policy, which is a central bank, try to moderate inflation from going high. So they raise their interest rates, right? So once they raise their interest rate, the cost of borrowing to the average person also becomes very high. So first, if you're a business and you rely on loans to do your everyday business, to go to Makola to pick goods, overnight, your cost of capital has increased, right? So the woman at Makola suddenly is feeling what happened thousands and thousands of kilometers away. And I think if we are able to connect these two, the average person understands that no woman, no man is an island. We are now a global village.
Is there any sustained or sustainable model that you have personally observed that you see, this looks like the one that could be the game changer for the continent?
I mean, Albert, it's a hard conversation. I think it's still work in progress. I mean, the optimism around Africa, I'm an eternal optimist when it comes to Africa. But there are things that I've observed in other countries that I can share. And for me, I feel that every country, there are 3 resources you need to focus on in order to move from emerging or developing into developed. And those 3 resources are natural resources, capital resources, and your human resources. Albert, I'm going to state on authority that you need at least 2 of these to develop, to break that cycle.
Why?
Simply because if you focus on only one, what you realize is that some other country that has figured out the 3 would count for yours, or figured out at least 2 will count for the other 2 that you are not focusing on. Let me give you an example, right? So you take China, right? So China realized that they didn't have a lot of natural resources at the moment, okay, like given its population. But then they realized there are 2 things they can actually get working in for itself, right? If they focus all the country's capital investment into strategic sectors, that can really go a long way. Then the second thing they realize is that they need to get the right human capital. So first, they started with investment, and secondly, the human capital. They have this very flagship program they call the 1,000 Talents Program. So all the graduates who have worked in Google, have gone to the Harvards and co., if you are willing to come back, they are willing to match your salary that you are getting. So they brought in the 1,000 talents plus the capital. And I bet what happened over the next 15 years, we've seen that Ghana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, where are our resources going?
China.
Exactly, right? So you figure out 2 and you realize that you have the capability to go somewhere else. It's like chess, right? You figure out your queen and then the rest, you realize that, you can actually go get down. So you look at most African countries, the focus has been on number 1, the natural resources. And I call that the gift of God. God has given it to everyone, right? But if you do not develop the capital to access these resources and develop the human resources to develop them, you would always wait for third parties. At the moment, we've got resources. I mean, talk of your lithium, your manganese. But then we've known that these resources have been there. It was actually a PhD thesis developed by a Ghanaian woman, I think in the 80s, which enabled someone was going through the thesis and like, oh, this thesis from the UK by a Ghanaian is telling us there's lithium here. So we've always known, Ghanaians have always known. But then why didn't we ever harness it? You don't have the capital, right? You don't have the human resources. But then someone else discovered it. They came with the capital, they came with the talent. And guess what? You lose the one that you have. So I think it's a very simplistic model, but every decision making should focus on these three things. Other than that, you realize that when gold prices peaked in the early 2000s, right? Or let's say towards the mid 2010s. And at the same time, we discovered oil. So that was where the Ghana optimism started. Everyone was like, this is the time. This is the new century. This is the beginning because we have oil, gold prices were high, cocoa prices were high. But Albert, this model that I'm giving you, if you don't add another, whether capital or whether human to it, in 10 years' time, we are back to IMF.
So, Dr. Ampofo, if I understand right, what you're saying is that at least two of these three, namely natural resources, capital, and then human resources, two of these three must be on point for you to have sustainable development.
Perfect.
If I may push further, I was reading something around Singapore this week, and I get a sense again that their model is almost like what you said about China. They didn't have natural, but they worked so hard on capital and human resource. And in both instances, the intentionality is evident. And the second thing that's evident is the medium to long-term perspective rather than immediate gains. Would it be a good conclusion to say that as we speak, majority of the African story hints around an over-reliance on natural with few solid capital and then human resource development?
Yeah. So, and there's a very classic example I usually share about the Middle East, right?
Okay.
So maybe a little bit biblical. So, in Genesis, Abraham has Ishmael, and in there, I think it's in Genesis 17. I'm with Reverend, so hopefully my verse is on point. Genesis 17.
Verifiable.
It talked about how God blessed Ishmael as well, even though that was not what God initially said. And I think for 2,000 plus years, everyone was wondering, what was this blessing that God gave Ishmael's people? But then, about a century ago, they discovered oil. So they moved from the hewers of wood to something much more drastic. But you see, the Middle Eastern story, even though God blessed them with those resources in Genesis, centuries or 2 millennia ago, they realized one thing. So at that point, so we're going to go into oil history, Albert. At the point where they discovered oil, like I said, these were people who were hewing wood, like hewers of wood, right? They had no capital, they had no expertise. So at that time, there were 7 big major oil companies in the world, all from the US and Europe. So the Rockefellers, and then what will become the Exxon, and then the Chevron. So the 7 sisters go to the Middle Eastern people and say, look, Kwasi's model, the 3 things, you only have 1. We can bring you the other 2, and we can help develop your oil. And of course, they had no choice than to accept the terms. So I'm making it very simple, but it was something like, all right, we get 20%. Since you came with the other 2, you can get 80%. So over the next 20 to 50 years, that was the model. But then within that period, Albert, you know what most of these Middle Eastern countries decided to do? So they understudied where the talent from these other 7 sisters companies were coming from. The Harvard, the Stanford, the Oxford. So they said, okay, take our children to these institutions, all right? And at the same time, whatever 20% money you're giving us as part of our 20%, we're going to put it in the pot. We won't touch it. So 20 to 30 years, the first round of licenses expired, and the 7 sisters came back and said, it's time to renew. You remember? We have the 2 resources, and you have only 1. They were like, oh, hang on. As you guys were making money, we're also taking our kids to Harvard. We also now have capital. We have banks, local banks, that can fund these exploration. So you know what? How about we do it 80 to 20? So you realize that in the 50s, so 40, 50 years ago, the top oil companies were the 7 Sisters America and then in Europe. Today, 8 out of the 10 top oil companies are what we call the NOCs, the national oil companies. So Libya, so Aramco, the most profitable company in the entire world by far, is Saudi's local government oil company. You have ADNOC in Dubai, and the list goes on and on and on. So how did they transition, like I said, from Heroes of Wood to running 8 out of the 10? And it comes down to understanding that, look, one, understand that timing is very important. Had they decided to go 80-20 at the beginning of the discovery, what would have happened? They probably would have never got the skill, because you need someone to transfer the skills to you, right? Capital, they probably wouldn't have managed it as they probably should. And a whole lot of things could have gone wrong. But then understanding that over 20 to 50 years, we will understudy, learn, and show ourselves approved, it paid off quite big. And today, they dominate the oil and gas industry.
Back to the same point. One is intentionality, and two is a long-term perspective.
Precisely.
So you're looking at a situation where the person is making that decision saying that we may be coming to the table with a disadvantage today. If I use your triangle model as a sample, that we have the natural resources, we don't have the capital, we don't have the human resource. So we will accept 20% of the gains today.
Yep.
But we are preparing ourselves so that in 30 years' time, we will not come to the table with the same liabilities or the same disadvantages. Would it not be the case that in our part of the world, across Africa, what was the case several years ago with resource distribution is probably the same or even worse today, after all the years or the decades of resource harvesting without we getting the best end of the stick? Are we better off, or we still haven't figured out this model that you're talking about?
Yeah, I still think that so the intentionality is an important step, right? And I think a few years ago I was at the African Union, and I posed a very simple question that everyone is talking about. For example, use battery value chain. Everyone is talking about we want to go further downstream on the battery value chain. And I ask a question: how many of your countries are actually offering any degree in battery engineering or in lithium mining, for example, right? And there was none. So how do you dominate the future if you're not prepared to be part of the innovative conversation or even have the right skills? So in the end, right, it's going to be a zero-sum game, right? We're going to get back to 20 years and it's still the same rhetoric about, oh, we want to do this, but nobody ever takes the first step, which is having your own capital. Like he who pays the piper calls the tune. If you're not willing to invest the $1 billion or the $500 million or the $700 million that would convert these from rocks to resources, then you have very little leverage in negotiations. And if you don't have the people, the local talent to develop this thing, to develop the IP, the intellectual property, to harness these, then we'll come back 30 years and it will simply be rhetoric.
Springboard your virtual university. My guest, Dr. Kwasi Ampofo. Our conversation is about exploring untapped resources. And our focus today is on what must Africa do differently, or if you want to call it so, low-hanging fruits Africa could consider as we plan for the future. So far, he's been telling us about a triangle of resources that every developmental model looks at. And he's saying that the three are natural capital and then human resources. And he's saying that you must have at least mastery over two to be able to sustain your development. It's becoming evident, as has been the case in many conversations over the years, that Africa tends to focus on the first of the three. What would it take to bring the other two to the table? This intentionality that he talks about, how can we bring it on board? And then very importantly, how do we swing from our seeming short-term mentality to a long-term mentality that says we may be disadvantaged today, but we will not be tomorrow? How do we get this kind of conversation to permeate all the centers of power and engagement? Because literally, you just pricked an issue when you said, okay, so it's bad, yes, but is there even a course in our universities that seeks to bring us closer to the conversation? Now, the centers of power include education, media, culture, sports, entertainment, governance. How do we get this mindset, these thoughts to permeate some of these all-important centers of power?
So for me, one of the privileges of my jobs is I get to work with a lot of governments. And it comes down to policy, everything. But it's not just the policy, right? So I realized how policy and decision making is made elsewhere around the world. And once again, like today, I came in with a triangle, a lot of triangles. I'm going to give you another triangle, right, of decision making. And let's use a classic example. An African country wants to build an airline, okay? So the first part of that triangle, the decision making or the policy making triangle, is why are we doing this, okay? And the way you ask the why would really have a big influence on the outcome. So I always share this classic example with you of New York Taxi has been in existence for 100 years, but never in their wildest imagination did they think about what Uber could do to disrupt their business model. Simply because for the 100 years New York Taxi existed, their why, we do this, we move cars from one point to the other. So if you're thinking of innovation, if you're thinking of solving a problem, if you're thinking of your next generation iteration, you think of improving the car. And that is why New York taxis, the car improved over the last 100 years, but not the experience. When Uber came in, their why was, why are we doing this? We're doing this to move people. And it's a very central difference, moving people and moving cars. So if it's about the people, it doesn't matter whether we use a boat. Today, I can buy a train ticket using my Uber app, right? So the people-centered, asking yourself the why. So let's go back to this classic airline example. Why are we doing this? It's not because we want to have, a Togo airline or a Benin airline or heck, even a Ghana airline, right? It's because we want to use this to boost domestic tourism. It's because we want to use this to generate revenue for government. It's because we want to use this for a whole lot of other factors. So then the next phase is the how. So you've listed all these parts of connectivity in that decision making. And you talked about education, media. So once you are framing it not because we want to build an airline, we are building an ecosystem around it. When you're sitting in your cabinet or your decision room, you don't just bring airline experts. How about you're going to bring an infrastructure guy and he or she will say that, look, for us to be able to have a good airline, we need a big airport. Because in the end of the day, right, I think once again, there's also the biblical, they were filling the barrel, the oil. And it was actually the barrel you have that determines how much oil you can take. So
It's a capacity issue. Yeah.
Exactly. It's a numbers game. Airline is not a business where you can you start small, you go big. Because if I'm flying to London today, I'm not going to have compassion on a local airline and say, okay, they just came. So if they charge me $300 more, it's fine. After all, they are new in the game. It doesn't matter. From the very first day you cut your teeth, the expectation is that your market, your competitor who has already finished paying his loan, your prices should be the same as them. So it's a numbers game. So then the airport person at the table there says that, look, let's get a bigger airport. And someone goes like, oh, you know what? If we are building a big airport, that will be out of the city. But we can put a rail line from that airport. So you have another person will say, I'm a policy strategist, and I've looked at Dubai and I realized Dubai had a competitive advantage. They are what they call an island of peace. It's a region that has a lot of stability issues. So if we can actually use this as a feeder point, a lot of airlines will not go to other parts in West Africa, but then they would go to Accra because we have the goodwill. If we can use that as a feeder to now feed into, so the Emirates and Co will bring people into Accra, and then you make it a regional airline that now take people to Togo, Ivory Coast, and all that. So you don't compete on international line, you compete on regional. And then someone says, okay, tourism. When they get to Accra, why don't we say, for example, if you stay 48 hours in Ghana, we'll give you a discount. But then that 48 hours, another person on the table says, like, we don't want them to spend only in Accra. They should go to Paga. So let's create this thing where, for example, we'll give you a card at Kutuka. Lovely looking gents and ladies will give you a card of the 13 most voted tourist places. If you get there, each of these, they'll give you a stamp. If you get this stamp in that card and you get all 13 stamps, when you come back to Kutuka in 48 hours, we will make you an honorary citizen of Ghana, sponsored by the airline. You take a picture and we'll give you a commemorative passport. So Albert, you see, we are building an airline, but having a lot of people in the room, you've created a whole ecosystem around the decision making. So by the time you go out to execute, you're not just building an airline, you're building airports, you're changing tourisms, you are impacting lives in Paga, and you are doing so much. So then the second part of the triangle is really the how we do it. How many people do you have in the room? How diverse is your decision making process? And the third thing, which I'll be very brief, is really about we should have the capability to do introspection on our decisions. In 3 years, even halfway, we can realize that, look, the tide is changing. COVID happened, tourism went down, everything. You look at Rwanda as an example. They invested a lot in buying new planes. They actually went all the way to visit Rwanda on the Arsenal jersey. I'm not saying that's why Arsenal is, but that's a story for another day. But unfortunately, COVID happened after making, I think the government spent a huge chunk of its GDP on the tourism initiatives, and then COVID happened. What do? You do an introspect and recalibrate, right? So I think we having that ability to do an introspect and review some of our decisions, there should always be a sunset clause. Every 3 years we'll come back. But I don't think it's something we do. Also, 3 things here. One, whenever we want to make a decision, we should ask ourselves the why. And the why shouldn't be just a linear view. The second thing, the how. The how should never involve 1 or 2 experts. We should have a very diverse expertise. And I'll bet you'll be amazed how much or how big the dream and the execution will grow if you have a diverse group of people in the room. And the third thing, we should have what it takes to introspect our decisions. Every policy, every decision should come with a sunset provision where every 3 years we go back and review it.
When I come back from this break, I'm going to ask you a very interesting question relating to what you just said. A personal experience about the way the interconnectedness of domestic tourism can have a multiplier effect, and see why it's not a low-hanging fruit that we could easily work with. This is Springboard, your virtual university. My guest is Dr. Kwasi Ampofo from BloombergNEF London. He's the head of mining and metals, and we are just having a conversation about, can we do something differently? Because beyond some point, I can tell you that this conversation has implications for Japa. If you don't know Japa, then you're not in Ghana. If you went to the airport yesterday or went to the airport today, you will find out that there are several young people who are just doing anything that they can to just leave the shores of this country, if that is what it takes to be able to live out their dreams. And in our recent focus group discussion here at Springboard, as part of our program with the Muscat Foundation, called Ghana Grows, in a recent focus group discussion, one young person said, if I have to sell my body to raise money to buy a ticket and leave this country, I'll do it. Has it become that bad? We need to have real conversations about Africa, about Ghana, and about our developmental model and what it takes to create a country that the young people of this country can be proud of and say, I want to live here and build my dreams right here. Let's come back from this conversation and scale up to the next level. In the midst of all this complexity, are there low-hanging fruits we can grab and run? Or is it possible that our governance model of 4-year elections is making it impossible for us to think long-term? Please don't go away.
Hello? Bye.
Well, everybody's heard about the bird. Bird is the word. Bird is the word. Well, don't you know about the bird? Well, everybody knows that the bird is the word. Bird is the word.
To consider the implications.
Hello? Well, everybody knows that the bird is the word. When
Whether it's 1924, 2024, or 2124, we've always known that you are driven by your sense of safety and well-being. It is what drives us to see you through from start to finish, from small to big. And in the last 100 years, as you have evolved, so have we also expanded to serve you in many ways. From cradle to grave, with expertise in insurance, life, pensions, properties, health, and for those beautiful, memorable goodbyes. It's 2024, and in all our markets, our pedigree is recognized, our strength respected, our expertise valued, and our solutions sought by all who desire an advantage in life. Experience the time-tested and truly trusted 100 years legacy of Ghana's oldest insurer. Take charge of your future now. Insurance, life, pensions, property management, funeral services, health insurance. Enterprise, your advantage.
This be me, Kobe, aka Kobe Boga, KB for short. And this is my sweetheart, Obahima. Today, I get big surprise for her. Charlie, gone are the days I couldn't spoil my girl. Now I'm engaged to the woman of my dreams. Don't just look at my success. To get here, I had to follow the process. Out of nowhere, I lost my job. But I believe in humble beginnings. I got an idea that I knew I could grow. I started from a small setup, then invested in growing my own coconuts. I then grew my product lines. Now, I sell to many supermarkets in the country. Fellow young Ghanaians, trust the process and keep hope alive.
Take advantage of agribusiness through the Ghana Grows program. Ghana Grows, Hope Day.
Welcome back to Springboard, your virtual university, and to this conversation about exploring untapped resources. Anytime I get into this conversation, it reminds me that things are not as bad as you think. On one hand, you feel almost impotent in the face of the huge gap between where you are as an individual, as an organization, as a nation, as a continent, and where you ought to be, but would always end it on the note of what is possible or what we can do starting today. So I'm going to come back to Dr. Kwasi Ampofo, my guest for today, who is based in the UK, works with BloombergNEF as the head of mining and metals, to bring us some perspective about what we can do going forward based on best practice elsewhere. But let me remind you that Springboard is brought to you by the Springboard Roadshow Foundation and proudly sponsored by MTN Ghana and the Enterprise Group, with media support from the Multimedia Group and the Graphic Communications Group. Talking about the Enterprise Group, let me remind you that our enterprise tip for the day is one of the issues you must be interested in if you think long term, and it's about a personal pension plan. What is a personal pension plan? And if anyone is listening to us today or watching us today, you must have a personal plan for your own pension beyond what is the mandatory or state required one that you invest in by compulsorily. So the response to that is that you can enhance your retirement benefits with a personal pension plan. This plan offers the opportunity to grow your retirement income, ensuring a comfortable retirement lifestyle. Let me just add that the personal pension plan is an optional addition to a compulsory requirement. So in mathematics, you may want to call it MX plus C or whatever you want to call it, but one part of your retirement plan is made for you by the state, and that is compulsory. Add on something that you do for yourself, and that tip is brought to you by the Enterprise Group, and the number to call 030-263-4777 or email info@myenterprisegroup.io. Enterprise is definitely your advantage. Question: before we went on a break, you touched on two things that caught one, in essence, that caught my attention, but there was an expression of it also that I found very interesting. You talked about the why, the how, and the introspection. So why referring to the reason for a program, project, or initiative being taken, the how, and you mentioned bringing diverse expertise to the table so that the solution will be integrated rather than a one-off that doesn't look at the other possible legs that could come out. And then finally, introspection or review to ensure that the original targets are on track, and if not, what alternatives could be considered. My mind went straight to the recent Dubai announcement, and from this part of the world, the interesting thing was also that there was no fanfare around the announcement. It was literally almost like a technical presentation that says, we'll build an airport, it will cost this much, we'll finish it by this time, 10 years time, and when it's completed, it will have this linkages, it will have this, it will have that, finished. And then it comes out with drawings, a program of action that everyone can buy into. Interestingly, on a personal note, I happened to be in that country when the announcement was made. You didn't see any banners, anything. It was just done. And I'm like, when will we get there? But on a brighter note, help us to understand the benefits of this integrated thing and why, if we did it that way, it will give us much more advantage.
Well, I think the first thing I was also, I read that news, and the first thing I actually noticed was the fact that, how do you are number one. You are the best airport. Why do you even bother to compete with yourself and grow bigger? So I think that's the first thing that we need to understand is that we should never rest. For a very long time, we were very good with agriculture, but then you can see that we sort of rest on our oars and then others have overtaken us. So one is never rest. We should always be looking at opportunities to disrupt ourselves. And then two, I think gradually, right? I love history. So over the last few months, I've actually taken history to try and understand the economic, the decision, the social, and some of the decisions that were made in the 50s and 60s in Ghana. And I can say that we've gradually transitioned from a technical economy to a political economy. Okay?
Explain.
So you take your radio, you put on your radio as an example. In the morning, prime time, 8 to 10. There are kids in cars listening to radios, adults going to work listening to radios. And I would say quite a majority, if not 100% of conversations all have to do with politics, okay? And so we've gradually transitioned. Every problem is sort of addressed from a political lens in the sense that, oh, we're doing this. But then, as you rightly mentioned, right, it was the technical people that actually adored it. It came with very detailed analysis on what it means for energy, what it means for tourism, what it means for all that. So I think the second thing is to come back to that era of the 50s and 60s where you read every government report. It's actually either the director, chief director, like it was purely technical people.
So we should bring the technocrats more to the forefront.
Exactly.
And reduce the use of the politicians as front-facing. But they will argue that ultimately this is about the votes. And you mentioned 2/3 of the world's GDP is going into elections this year, ultimately. So the political forces would argue that decisions are made based on these things. And so I must be seen cutting the sword, I must be seen making the speech. But you're saying that the technocrats must do that.
No, it's not even there. I mean, all politics is local. But then, Albert, imagine that there was a bridge, okay? A bridge built by technical, competent organization. Most technocrats would not even want to cut swords. That's not what they are made for. But let us do our job. Don't get in our way. Let us deliver. So you're a politician, you're cutting the sword for one of the most advanced bridges ever built in Ghana, right? And on the left-hand side, you're cutting sword to some shabby, people see through it, right? So the point is that it's not to let the technocrats lead. At least let's give due honor to electable power. They go to the people to seek mandate. But what the point is that politicians or the political economy should give way to the technical economy to deliver on its mandates as well.
And you're saying that should reflect also in the media conversations,
Exactly.
and then by extension in the education. You mentioned education.
Exactly.
What about arts, culture, entertainment? Can we ever get to the point where some of these themes, these seeming complex, high-level themes permeate other parts of our life as well?
So there's an interesting, so you wonder how there's this general narrative about if a billionaire wants to avoid taxes, they invest in art. So you know how it happened? I think it's important. We don't even have a non-profit board, right? We don't even have a revenue sharing model where the government, so that's why they're called non-governmental organizations. I should have the option. I'm in the UK, Australia, US. You should have the option. If I'm giving away my taxes, I should have the option that I'll give this to government. So when I pay tax, but at the same time, I will give $100 to these non-governmental organizations, and then I'll claim it back for my taxes from government. Okay, so we need, and to be able to do that, so like I said, we need a non-profit board that ensures that the non-profits are doing what they say they'll do. Because if the people are giving you their financial mandate to give us museums, to give us arts, to give us music, and these things that make quality of life good, it's important that the public have confidence in it. So that's one way to do it, like having a board that sort of ensures they're doing the right thing. But government also incentivizes us to directly give to these arts. And you and I know we love theater.
I'll come to the way forward, but let me quickly touch on something that you mentioned, and it's about leveraging. I love domestic tourism, and anytime I go to some of my favorite spots are nowhere near the Greater Accra region. I go eastward, I go westward, I go northwards, and I tell myself, listen, many people when they get to travel around the country are surprised at how good things are outside the part of the country they are familiar with. So you talked about the incentive that you could give at airports as one of the solutions we could adopt. I've been in countries where, and let me use South Africa in UK. So I had an experience with hotels in South Africa. The same chain. You sleep in the first one, you pay full price. The second one, you pay 25% off. The third one, 50% off. And you're using different parts of the country. So let's say you slept in Accra. You are forced in the second night not to sleep in Accra, or the third night to move to, let's say, Volta region. And for every hotel you sleep in that Volta or that chain of hotels, you get 25% discount. You move to Bronga, Hafo, or Ashanti, you get another 50% discount. By the time you get to Tamale, you get to 75% discount. Then when you get to the Western, it's 100%. By the fifth hotel, you sleep there for free. Meanwhile, guess what? It is being shared. Yeah. So you are forced to explore the whole country. You pay for your extras, leave the country a very happy person. And it also cuts back on rural-urban migration or warped development. Same thing in the UK. You went to Madame Tussauds one day, you had a fun time, and they say, oh, if you went to the Thorpe Park, way outside London, you get 50% discount. You have no business there, but you are forced to go there and spend your money there. It looks to me like a low-hanging fruit. Yeah. Why can't we do something like that? Or what are the benefits of doing something like that in our country?
No, it's great. And so there are two things I want to highlight here. So this whole concept became very popular over the last decade, but I think Richard Taylor. So the concept of nudge. So nudge,
really for me.
NUDGE.
Okay, nudge, okay.
Yeah, so, and look, I think a few years ago, it actually won the Nobel Prize for economics. And government, so when he started pushing this theory, it already existed, but then bringing it into government, it made sense to so many governments that David Cameron, actually in the office of the presidency, so it's behavioral economics, essentially.
Behavioral economics,
okay. Yeah, so the nickname is a nudge. So David Cameron had a behavioral economics team under the presidency. Obama also has something similar. Australian government also has something similar. And so what's behavioral economics? So you realize that we talk about carrot and stick in influencing people to do things, right? So, but how do you influence people in the most subtle way? So, Albert, 70%, 50%, 80%, what they were doing is pretty much nudging you to spread your dollar. You probably were hoping to spend $1,000 in Johannesburg, but by the time that you reach the Eastern Cape or other parts of the country, you probably spend $2,000. You spend more, but you've not already spent it in Joburg. You spent it in other states as well. So I think it's important for African countries to look at, it's not every decision that requires a carrot or a stick. There are some changes you can make to behaviors that are very subtle. But then once again, it goes back to an early point we made. Who do you have in your room that you make decisions in?
So you're saying that the cabinet meeting must have a list of experts in there, each one coming to the table with clarity about what we should be doing differently.
Yes. I mean, I've not seen if you've seen those White House movies about how, so the politicians are there and okay, they bring up a topic and obviously this is Hollywood, but I'm assuming it's the real, that's what happens there. So let's talk about football economy, right? So they would talk the political side of it, but then you see 3 footballers, 3 coaches come in there, spend 5 minutes with them, give them their expert opinion and go back. And then, like I said, you give honor to electable power. They go to the people for mandate, so they have to make the decisions. But then they shouldn't make decisions without hearing from a broad and diverse expert. And I think it's important if we infuse that, and behavioral economics is just one of a lot of examples that we can implement.
What kind of pressure does the election cycle and the highly polarized, you call it the political economy, and so it's become less of a technical economy and more of a political economy? I mean, as you sit with people, and whenever anything is announced, no matter how beautiful it is, no matter how proven it is around the world, depending on who is announcing it, immediately it is put into a lens. This is this side, that is that side. This side good, this side bad.
Well, it's common, right? It's common. So I have a not so popular opinion when it comes to these things that so I don't believe that there should be a big emphasis on whatever. Like, there are two things that I think what distinguishes great nations from the other is not the style of government. Like the British have a quasi monarchy system. It works for them, right? You go to Middle Eastern, it's purely monarchy, right? You go to Australia, it's purely parliamentary democracy. America, you think blue-red is worse in Ghana, go to America, it's worse. But they're still developing, right? I've been to military countries where they still manage to get ahead. Even in Ghana, we've experimented from monarchy to one-party state, to military, to parliamentary democracy, to military again, into what we call the multi-party democracy. But in all this, there has been a consistency of us not being able to achieve what we intend to. And I'll bet there's a magic word I'm going to give you. If you look across all these forms of government around the world, those who succeed, they practice a meritocratic system. It doesn't matter whether it's military, whether it's this, whether it's... Everyone has its pros and cons, right? But then having the right people doing the right things at the right time is a magic sauce. 4 years, 3 years, 2 years, 1 year, all you need is meritocracy. So that's one. The second thing, once again, very unpopular opinion, I feel that we understand the concept of separation of powers between judiciary, parliamentary, and the executive. But I feel that at the executive, where a lot is at stake, we also need redundancy. Albert, as we speak now, I was in Kofredo and I was wondering why certain gutters were not built. And I was told that, the decision from the top, which is the Jubilee House, has not been made on these gutters. And I wonder, should it take decision-making all the way to the top for something as basic as a gutter in front of my house to be built, right? And then you look at the economies that succeed, they build redundancies. It doesn't matter who is president of America. There's federal, there's state, there's local. Each of these have entirely different responsibilities. The federal government can decide, today we are at peace with this, tomorrow this becomes an adversary. Those are big macro things, right? We're going to build national highways. At the regional level, hospitals, schools. At the local level, I'll make sure that every gutter. So we need to build a little bit of a sophisticated economy where there are so many redundancies that if federal is not performing over this 4 year mark, at least state will. Right? We have the region. If state at some point, at least local will. So you realize that the American economy has built those redundancies at the executive level, which I call the separation of powers. So you have local taxes accountable to a local leadership, state taxes accountable to a state government, then federal government. And for us, it's a very simplistic one man. So for me, I think I know people, like I know one of my first managers I ever reported to Seth Quay, and I would say this, that having reported to him, if you gave this man 4 years, he would turn around Ghana.
That's a big endorsement.
No, meritocracy and building redundancies. No, I looked at him and I think I told him, give him 4 years.
That's certainly what you think about him.
I think there was a time I feel revealing, but then there was a time that I actually wrote to my university when I was in Ghana then that give this man an honorary doctorate. He deserves it.
And he got it.
Oh yeah. He actually, I think I was in Australia, I went later. That year he didn't get it, but then ultimately I think he got a bit. Yeah.
So hello to my brother. My brother for the past 45 years, Seth Quay, Pakwisi thinks that if you were given the mandate to run a country, you would transform it in 4 years. That's a huge endorsement. And I love it when this happens on Springboard. People mention former bosses. And I had a big one with Jesse mentioning Niyama the last time. Niyama Famille is another good brother of mine. It's lovely when I hear people endorse their former bosses and say, what I saw from this person gave me a lot of hope and inspiration that it can be done. So let me swing now to my final question to you, Dr. Kwasi Ampofo. You've shared perspectives on meritocracy and redundancy as low-hanging fruits that we can take. I can't help but ask you your thoughts about education and then maybe the financial sector. What changes can we make in those spaces to be able to action or realize our gains as a country and continent?
Okay, so I'll start a few seconds and be a bit philosophical, and I'll use that to give you a practical example. So there are three ways human beings learn, right? So we learn through DNA is encrypted in our system. But no one taught you to cry when you were born. No one teaches you to walk, right? The second phase is culture, and the third is education. So that's the three ways across every society. Culture and the final part, which is the most important part of learnings for humans, is education. And this is where the cracks begin to reveal the countries that have it and those that don't have it. Because we all know how to cry. We all learn how to walk as humans. Whether you're Chinese, whether you're German, we all cry the same. Culture. So you move from the unconscious, which is the DNA, to the subconscious, which is a culture. Your culture teaches you to say, yes, please, yes, please, yes, please. That's conscious. But then the conscious one is education. And Albert, this is where I've seen others do it quite well. Practical education is an example. So what do I mean by practical education? Ghana has transitioned. So 20 years ago, we were an agrarian economy. Agriculture was the biggest part of our GDP. Now it's services, IT, finance, and all that. And to be able to build a service economy that is competitive globally, you need to train your people differently. And how we provide them that education, which is the third stage. So unconscious, subconscious, conscious. The conscious effort to train your skills relevant to these things. So I think that's the important thing I want to leave with that. We need to upgrade our education. You can't change the unconscious, subconscious, you can influence it. The culture is beautiful. But then the final thing is education, the practical, impactful education that aligns with where the economy is going. You talk about finance. And one of my classic examples, I was with my brother Jojo in Morocco a few months ago, and he made an interesting point, okay, on how, so not necessarily finance, but then an allied industry, so sort of agritech. He works in the startup bootcamp, and he tells me about, or he told the audience about this beautiful story of two organizations, one in Senegal, one in Morocco. So farmers were having a lot of post-harvest losses, right? They plant and then they are not able to get it. And in the Western world, last mile delivery is the most important. But in Africa, I see the first mile is the most important, the farmer to train. So if you think solving Africa's agri problem is building trains, then you've missed the point, right? Because the train tracks will not go to the first mile. So what Jojo's team looked at is that there's a Senegalese Limawa, which is looking at actually, rather than import big trucks, refrigerated trucks at thousands of dollars, they have these small tuk-tuks or motorbikes, solar-powered coolers that does the first mile, okay? But then how would you know that the plant is ripe, you need a lot of data because you are running a nimble system. So then another company comes in, which is what SafeTrack from Morocco, comes in and puts all these AI stuff. I mean, I don't want to sound expert, you should talk to Jared, but then put these two together. So Albert, what am I saying? Whether it's finance, whether it's agric, look, Africans are doing amazing things. I don't want to spend the last couple of minutes talking about how Africa can learn. There's a lot African can teach the world too. This is a classic example. But then what was the lightning fuse? It's collaboration. One company realized that there is somebody doing something in Morocco. There's somebody doing something in Senegal. If I put these two together, they would create one of the most symbiotic ecosystems that could reduce post-harvest losses by 40%. And that is what African leaders should do for the youth. Don't stand in the way. Create an enabling, collaborative environment, and the youth will make magic happen.
Let me sign off on this by asking you to speak directly to young people. And I must say that it's very heartwarming to hear you talk about yourself and your brother Jojo meeting in Morocco at an international conference, both of you experts in your own fields. Yeah. And I envy you for that. I mean, and just by the way, just for you to know, practically he's my nephew, so he's talking about my son Jojo and himself meeting together in Morocco and at a conference from different technical perspectives. So that's just by way of disclosure. But Kwasi, it will be important before we sign off to speak directly to the young people watching you. I mean, you've been young. You still will think you are young, but there's a generation also after you trying to live out their dreams. And you talked about the fact that there is sometimes culture makes you ambiguous, and that ambiguous person suddenly finds himself or herself in the midst of other people, and they struggle to see, why are they thinking differently? So, having worked in different parts of the world, let's share a few thoughts from you with that young person who's also trying to become a relevant person beyond their immediate environs. And that should be your closing thoughts. So, help somebody.
Yeah, but so I think one thing I picked from you growing up was reading. And fortunately, we're in an era of internet. So we didn't, back then, you would wait for what, 2 years, 3 years for the new books to come to Ghana and then before you purchase them. So I think for me, I love biographies, right? If I want to do something, if I want to get into an industry, the first thing I want to look at is who are some of the successful people in these industries that I want to be like. And then I start reading about them. And you realize that, look, it's by no fault of ours. We all grow up in a very narrow worldview culturally. So I think the first thing to be able to break into that global environment is really, number one, broaden your horizon. Fortunately for us, the internet makes the world a village. So broaden that horizon, read, learn, study to show yourself approved. The second thing is to tap into opportunities. I mean, when I applied for my postgrad as an example, I only saw that opportunity. The traditional Ghanaian mentality would have told me that, look, you don't have any connection, you don't know anyone there, why do you apply in the first place? But then having that courage that if I'm qualified today in Ghana, I'm qualified globally anywhere, and I believe that if I apply, I will be fortunate. So one, broaden that horizon by learning, but then two, the internet being a village means that yes, you're competing with the world, but you also have the same amount of opportunities that they have. And I think the third thing is resilience. African youth are resilient. We don't say it enough, but then you are resilient. You're doing great. And sometimes you can see other institutions or other, especially in the startup economy. I have a friend who tells me that if he was in Silicon Valley, he could raise $1 million today or tomorrow. But then unfortunately, in Ghana, your resilience would pay off. And what I would say is that don't give up. Keep trying. Look out for those opportunities globally. Search those mentors and biographies that would enable you to study to show yourself approved and become like them. And with that, like I told Albert, magic will happen.
On that very magical note, I want to say a big thank you to you, Dr. Kwasi Ampofo. And for those of you who may have joined us along the line, Dr. Ampofo works at BloombergNEF based in the UK, and he's the head of mining and metals. And it's always a joy to have you back here as faculty in the virtual university. My learnings from you today hinge on about 7 or 8 triangles that you shared. You always talk in threes. So I'll take 4 of those triangles, or maybe 3 of them, for the benefit of our listeners and viewers who may have joined us late. The first was the global triangle of events that are impacting our world today from the past year, and there were elections, conflict, and technology. The second triangle was about the resource triangle, and that is natural, capital, and human, and how these impact our programs. But the third one is probably the one that dominated this conversation. That is the developmental paradigm. And it says there must be the why of what you do, there must be the how of what you do, and there must be the introspection of what you do. And of the 3, my favorite, guess what, is the how, where you talked about bringing various experts to the table in these developmental and policy conversations to ensure that the program of action does not stand on one leg, but on several legs. Your magic word for today is meritocracy. You're saying that no matter the government model or the political model that you assume, the common factor in all countries that are doing well is meritocracy. The person who is doing well gets to have the job, not any other consideration. It's always a joy to have you. Let's do this again.
Thanks, Albert.
Right, so let's continue this conversation on social media. Which of these points, which of these triangles is your favorite? Choose the one you prefer and let's debate it. Are you inspired? Are you challenged? Are you seeing a low-hanging fruit you can work with starting from today? And are these lessons for governments, or you can run your organization, your church, anything else that you are doing, you're not for profit, with these same lessons? And I know we see that they are very, very applicable. And then finally, what will you do differently starting today? Not tomorrow, not next month, starting today, that you would look back at 10 years from now and still say, wow, this was the turning point in my life. On that note, let's continue this conversation on social media, and let's continue exploring untapped resources that we can leverage to become better as a people. My name is Albert Ocran, saying thank you on behalf of the Springboard Roadshow Foundation and also our sponsors, MTN Ghana and the Enterprise Group, and our media partners, the Multimedia Group and the Graphic Communications Group. So we come your way again next week. My name is Albert on the Virtual University Springboard, saying God bless you, and God bless you.
Turn around.